Is that recording now? It's recording. Okay, just admit everyone in. We've got about nearly 200 people registered for this. So
I think, Professor Gandhi, I think there's like a slight delay in the communication. So I'm gonna make sure that I just like stop talking. You know, I'll try to talk in like segments and not cut you off. That way, but it's easier for people to.
Okay, Jack, we're gonna start now. Okay, folks, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to the Islamic Courses session titled Book Review Discussion, The Emperor Who Never Was, Dara Shukoh in Mughal India. Very privileged honor to have Dr. Supriya Gandhi from the Yale University, the US of A, and it's hosted by our dear friend, Professor Jonathan A.C. Brown. Okay, so quick reminder to everyone, housekeeping rules, please keep your devices on silent or mute. It is being recorded. There is a Q&A session. The format is quickly going to be, Jonathan's going to be talking to Dr. Supriya in an interview style for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have the last 30 minutes or so for Q&A, and I'll explain when we get to the Q&A how we're going to do it. You can write it down, or you can raise your hand on Zoom also. So everyone should have read the blurb, and just a reminder, quick, and we're going to have, before I hand it over to Jack, just a reminder for everyone, Dr. Supriya holds a PhD from Harvard University, Masters from SOAS in London. Her research examines the interface of Islam and Indic religions in South Asia. Interestingly includes religious and cultural history of the Mughal Empire, Islamic mysticism, grew up in India, studied as well as Iran and Syria, and then a doctorate. Currently, she's an assistant professor at Yale University, Religious Studies, and the author of The Emperor Who Never Was, Dara Shukoh. Next project hopes to explore the role of Persian culture and intellectual in the making of modern Hinduism. So without further ado, Jack, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mizan. It's always great seeing you, even despite whatever your latest clothing choices are. I also want to be. I want to say this because in Professor Gandhi's defense, due to some kind of administrative oversight, which is not Mizan's fault, definitely, is she actually had no idea that I was going to be the person interviewing her. So just, she is not responsible for my presence or her presence in my presence.
I love your new hairstyle, Jack. Beautiful.
Thank you, Mizan. I have a ponytail. I'm just hoping that I don't like turn my head so that, anyway. Like it's interesting times. First of all, Professor Gandhi, I really like this book a lot. People say that I don't read a lot of books, to be honest, which is kind of weird, but I actually read this one. Not only did I read it cover to cover, but I bought the book, and it's because I somehow I got a picture of Jahanara's calligraphy that you have in the book, right? I think that's, if I'm getting her name right. Mm-hmm. And I saw it on social media. I was like, wow, that's really interesting. I looked at the book, and I did the Amazon look inside. I started reading next page. I was like, okay, I gotta buy the book. So I bought the book. I really recommend it. It's a really pleasurable and engaging read, and it's also, I think, fascinating from at every level, kind of aesthetically and from a scholarly level as well. So here's the book right here. You can see that I'm not lying. I actually have a copy, and it's not a picture either. See, look, it's 3-dimensional. So there's so many things to talk about, but maybe just in case anybody doesn't know the sort of quick story of Dara Shukoh, maybe you can give a not elevator pitch, but sort of 1960s creaky New York old building elevator as it goes up from the bottom floor to like the 6th floor pitch of the story of Dara Shukoh and the kind of the drama around him.
Sure. So thank you. Thank you for your kind words, and thank you, Mizan, for inviting me to this forum. Before I begin, so just a little thing about your comment about reading the book. I was so thrilled to hear that, because the way I sort of planned and designed this book was exactly that, as something that I hoped would be read from cover to cover. The way we often read and consume books these days is, individual segments, often reading on our screens, we might read the introduction of an academic book and then, maybe skim through a couple of chapters and look at the conclusion to see what the argument was. So for this book, I wanted the argument to be in the narrative. And I designed it sort of like a novelist might. So my aim wasn't to put every fact in the world about Dara Shukoh into this book. In fact, there are lots of things that I sort of discovered that I didn't make it into the book. But I wanted to weave together a story that complicated and disturbed the origin myth that is the subject of the book. So Dara Shukoh, who was the eldest son and heir of the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, is often seen, as my title suggests, as this fateful possibility in the subcontinent's history. So the Dara Shukoh was this favored son and heir of a Mughal emperor. From early on, he was inclined towards Sufism. Again, that wasn't particularly unusual, but he actually got initiated into a Sufi order, into the Qadri order, along with his sister Jahanara. He pursued his studies of Sufi thought. He also started developing an interest in Indic religions. So we can see some traces early on of how he got interested. He then took that further. He had dialogues with Hindu ascetics. He then commissioned translations of Indic texts from Sanskrit into Persian, wrote his own comparative study called the Majma al-Bahrain, the sort of confluence of two oceans. And then he also translated the Upanishads, Hindu sacred texts, with the help of Pandits, of sort of Brahmin intellectuals, from Sanskrit into Persian. And that was sort of the pinnacle of his scholarly achievements, which also, I argue, tied into his self-fashioning as a ruler. So Dara Shukoh is often seen as this prince who's always in his ivory tower. He was a mystic. He was unfit to be a ruler. And then he was finally vanquished in a fierce struggle for succession to the throne by his brother Aurangzeb. And the typical view is, of course, there are some people who view Aurangzeb more favorably. There are some who view him less favorably, but they share the view that Aurangzeb was he was more ruthless, more scheming, and therefore more cut out to be a ruler, because Dara didn't really see himself as a ruler. So what I argue is that Dara's kind of self-cultivation of his his spiritual and intellectual self-cultivation was really in line with a precedent that one had in the Mughal Empire. He was fashioning himself as a sacred king, like those before him, but also he was adding to this. So my book is really a story about Dara Shukoh, and the details are important. The way the story is told is different. The basic outlines is the same, that that there were these brothers, and in the end, only one of them came to the throne.
I like the way you start the book, because you sort of dive right into the main existence of these figures in the world today, which is this sort of like good guy, bad guy. Like Mizan sent me this thing about this new Bollywood movie called Takht, about
yes.
and it's about Aurangzeb and Dara Shukoh. I was like, oh, who's going to be the bad guy? I wonder. So you talk about this sort of, I think it's a play being put on in India, in Delhi, maybe, or like a kind of a, I think that's
this is actually a play in London.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And that so you start the book and you think the reader thinks you're describing the actual events, but you're actually describing the play about the actual event. So you kind of immediately go into this, the life of these characters in the imagination of people today, which I think is, I think it's like good to just grab that by the neck at the beginning, as opposed to sort of having to deal with it throughout the book. I thought that was a great move, a narrative move. But kind of building on what you just said, yeah, I think the sense I get is, people always think of Dara as this, like, as you sort of like intellectual guy in the library who's sitting there writing, and you can't even imagine him being, he's like not really like his other brothers, but you do a great job of showing, like, not only as you said that this was part of his fashioning himself as a ruler, part of his way of doing like outreach to, I think you said the kind of the peak of his activity, of his deepest dive into study of Indic religions coincides with his outreach to these different Rajput allies that he's trying to get on his side. In the kind of, I guess, maybe decades of leading up to what everybody knows is going to be this normal fratricidal struggle for the throne. But also something that you talk about is that, I think, if I recall, is that he really positioned himself where he's going to stay in Delhi. He's going to stay by his father's side, and like that's his tactic, right? And Aurangzeb is like he seems to be disadvantaged just because he's out in the field, it's a provincial governor or something. And looking back at what happened and the eventual victory, which may just be the result of that one battle, maybe if it had gone differently, it would have been totally a different result. But do you think that one of their tactics was sort of destined to be more successful than the other? One of their strategies was destined to be more successful than the other?
Yes. There's been some work by Monis Faruqi that argues that when princes were given assignments, governorships, and so on in far-flung areas away from the court, that then enabled them to gain some experience, some military experience, governing experience, build up networks, and therefore position themselves in a bid for the throne. And Dara Shukoh didn't quite get that experience. It was really during the struggle for succession that he had to try to hone his military skills. Now, of course, he was still angling for the throne before, and he used other ways to do this. Now, there wasn't any single formula for Mughal succession. There was a move away from an idea that was more akin to the older Timurid idea of shared sovereignty. But then one finds different Mughal rulers favoring one son over the other, even though that doesn't always work out. So Jahangir too had favorites. He favored Khurram for a while. He then favored some of his other sons at other points. Even though Khurram, later Shah Jahan, eventually got the throne. So favoring one son was not necessarily a formula for that son's success, but it was still something that the emperors did in order to control how succession would play out.
You talk about, I think one thing that comes up in the book as a theme is the idea that Dara is he's an interesting figure, but he's not unique. His interests are not unique. His relationship building is not unique. And one thing, so you talk about the figure of Baba Lal, who is, if I'm not mistaken, a kind of Hindu sort of ascetic mystic figure, and that he, Shah Jahan becomes his devotee, as does Dara, as does Aurangzeb. So I thought that was also interesting that you have Aurangzeb is also, am I correct in that?
Not quite, not quite with Baba Lal, but I can say something about that in a bit.
Go ahead. Yeah, then but this idea of the kind of it's not just Dara who goes out and decides, I'm going to go talk to Hindu ascetics. Like that this is a tradition that goes before him and then after him.
Yeah. So in fact, if you look at Dara's grandfather, Jahangir, with whom, he doesn't overtly model himself on Jahangir, but he does, have some hints that he's opposed to him. He's critical of Jahangir in his Sakinatul Awliya, his kind of second kind of major Sufi work. Jahangir in many ways is really the model for Dara. When Jahangir is a prince, He sets up his own court in Allahabad, and he gets a whole lot of texts translated from Hindavi and Sanskrit into Persian and made into these lavishly illustrated manuscripts. The idea of dialogue was a really important, both a visual motif and a trope and a theme in the way Jahangir conducted himself. He had dialogues with a whole range of people, including visiting Europeans and so on, people from Central Asia, and a Hindu sage known as Jadrup in the Mughal sources. His name might have actually been Chidrup. So Jahangir is constantly having these dialogues with Chidrup, and he calls Chidrup a Mubahid, and he says that we are talking about Vedanta, which is the same as Tasawwuf. So he makes this equation between these two conceptions of monism and sort of Tawheed, and he identifies them. And constantly has these dialogues, and of course, and these dialogues are made into an event by the visual and textual practices of Jahangir's court. He has them illustrated, he writes about them. So this is something that becomes etched in memory as, this is what an emperor does. So this was his own way in kind of enacting what his own father Akbar had started. And then Dara Shukoh is continuing that. So he's modeling himself on that. So yes, so he shares a similarity with his grandfather in this manner. And then with regard to Dara's own Sufi pir, there are actually two of them. One is Mia Mir, who's based in Lahore, and he passes away fairly early on in Dara Shukoh's life. And then there is his successor, Mullah Shah Badakhshi, who's a Qadiri Sufi. He's originally from Central Asia, and he carries on this lineage of the Qadiri order, and he's based in Kashmir. And the typical narrative is that, of course, it's like Dara Shukoh, who just, is completely sort of besotted with his Sufi pir and becomes sort of lost to this. But if one looks at a range of accounts, including there's one really crucial account by one of Mullah Shah's disciples, who also becomes an imperial servant and kind of shuttles between the two arenas, that we see that Mullah Shah is initially, he's kind of standoffish with Dara Shukoh and with Jahanara. He gains his own spiritual status by having a little bit of distance from the royal court. Again, we've seen this in much earlier on with Nizamuddin Aulia. We've seen this with a lot of Sufis who maintain their spiritual authority by having a little bit of a distance from the powers that be. But with Mullah Shah, he actually meets Shah Jahan. And it's Shah Jahan who initially introduces Dara Shukoh to these Sufis. So one theme that I've tracked through the book is the relationship of the whole imperial family, Shah Jahan, Jahanara, who's really, kind of a spiritual companion of Dara Shukoh on the Sufi path. So Dara Shukoh, Jahanara, and Shah Jahan, who have this relationship with the Qadri order.
So on 167, I'm gonna write in a clarification because I missed it. So according to the memory of these encounters endorsed at the Dyanpur shrine today, Baba Lal dazzled Dara Shukoh, Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb alike, and they all became his followers. But do you mean that Dara Shukoh became more of a follower than the others, or they all sort of had equal interest, but it was not deep, in-depth interest?
Yes. So this is a narrative that we have from the tradition of Baba Lal. Now, this was very common in the subcontinent. We have various yogis, sannyasis, Sufis, whose own followers have narratives that particular holy figure dazzled the emperor, that they had the emperor bow down before them, or that he had a prophecy and that came true, and then the emperor accepted it. So these are tropes that we have from accounts that are made from the perspective of a particular religious order and its followers. But it's not necessarily the objective reality. I think I mentioned that because I was talking about how we have so many different accounts of the Baba Lal dialogues.
Thank you. Going back to this idea of you talked about the muwahid or muvahid, right? Is Dara Shukoh a guy who's interested in Indian religion and Hinduism, or is he interested in a specific strain within Indian religion and Hinduism, which I think you talk about, kind of non-dualistic, monistic, Advaita Vedanta? And so, I mean, is it more to say, is he interested in Indian religion overall, or is he interested in this like Tawhidi monistic strain that he identifies in the Majma al-Bahrain and the Sir al-Asrar?
Yeah. So first of all, now, of course, I think it's absolutely fine to talk about Hinduism because we need words. We need to use categories to make sense of phenomena. But I don't, it's very difficult to talk about a Hinduism existing in the pre-colonial times, the way it crystallized in the 19th century. So our idea of Hinduism today is not necessarily the idea at that point. And I would definitely distinguish Dara Shukoh's own interests from some other studies that had taken place. Now, for instance, if you look at the Ain-e-Akbari, which was something that was produced by Abul Fazl in the court of Akbar, Dara's great-grandfather. The Ain-e-Akbari seeks to map out a range of different kind of philosophical schools. So its aim is to catalog, to enumerate, you see similar things in Shahristani's, Al-Milal wal-Nahal, which, you might be familiar with. So Dara Shukoh's aim was not necessarily to catalog all the different sort of beliefs of the Indians, of the Hunud. He was interested in pursuing the more monistic and sort of monotheistic strands. But this interest too got refined as he kind of proceeded alongside this path. Already in the Mughal library, there were translations of the Ramayana, a major sort of Hindu epic that has political resonances. There were translations of the Razamnama. There were translations of this other work, the Yoga Vasishtha, and different versions of it. And I can speak more about that in a bit. It was really, really crucial for the Mughals. So he had access to these. And in the transcriptions, again, we have different versions of this, of the Babalal dialogues. We can see that, yes, he was familiar with these different texts. And he asks various questions about image worship and about, kind of the ethics of, sort of Ram doing this and so on. And then in his Majma al-Bahrain, he has exposure to a whole eclectic range of texts as well. We can see some ideas from Nyaya Vaisheshika, for instance, which is one kind of philosophical school. We can see ideas from Sankhya. So this is when he talks about the elements, for instance. We can see that he's familiar with a text known as the Bhagavata Purana. Now, there's definitely a monotheistic element here, not necessarily monistic. All of this gets whittled down as he proceeds along this path. So he's made his equivalences. He's done this particular intellectual work. But to get to the next level, he is looking for the font of Tawheed, which he finds in the Upanishads, and especially the ones that have a more monistic sensibility.
By the way, for all you kids out there, right? I mean, if you're interested, one of the things that I think is really interesting about this book for people who come more from a sort of Islamic studies, kind of Islamic thought angle, is that it really lays out very clearly and accessibly how a Muslim scholarly endeavor like Dara Shukoh may reconcile kind of I'll just use the word Hindu because I don't know what correct word. Hindu sort of cosmology and notions of time. And I think the calendar you get into is really interesting. Like, how do you reconcile kind of this Abrahamic and Hindu cosmic calendars and historical calendars in terms of epochs, and you show kind of what are the tools they use. So at one point you're talking about Abdurrahman Chishti, and I think he this text, the Bashisht, which is the one I think you might have mentioned, and what are some of this also appears in the Sir Asrar. How do Muslim scholars coming from a sort of a Ibn Arabi or sort of theosophical monistic view, what are some of the tools they use, like jinn and angels and prophets and things like that, to reconcile these different timelines and pantheons of deities?
Yeah, well, so this is a really active process of translation, and some of the work had already been done for Dara Shukoh, in that there were foundations that were laid during the time of Akbar and the massive translation projects that took place in that era. Of course, Dara Shukoh, as usual, takes this a step further. One anxiety was how to deal with the idea of multiple deities. Now, it's not as though, one can say that, Indians and Hindus are like all polytheistic, as opposed to a sort of monotheistic Islam. There were many of the Brahmin intellectuals who were interlocutors for Dara Shukoh, for previous Mughal translators, would have also had a kind of monotheistic worldview, or one in which a kind of single divine was also prioritized, especially or in certain contexts. But still, one has to grapple with the presence of all these different deities in the texts that are translated. So one strategy was to make them into just kind of agents, like sort of muwakkil or angels, subordinate to a central deity, a central kind of formless divine that was assumed.
One of the books that you mentioned, which I thought was really interesting, was this book Dabistani Hind. And I don't know if you can talk about that as like a part of this process of study and of kind of cross-cultural study, or how did it end up helping you in writing the book?
Oh yeah, so this is the Dabistani Mazahib, or kind of the school of religions, the school of religious paths. Again, so mazhab here, has this valence of a particular school of thought or of religion. Again, we have so many different terms that we could translate into the English word religion as used today. Now, the Dabistan is a fascinating text. It's sort of almost unique in that its author actually goes around and seeks to produce a sort of ethnographic description of the religion of these, these sort of different peoples that he discusses. So it's based on a sort of surreptitious kind of ethnographic research that's being done in the 17th century. And there's a lot of controversy about the author. Modern scholarship is sort of in agreement today that it was done by somebody who was a follower of the Iranian free thinker Ozar Kayvan, kind of stemming from Zoroastrianism, but kind of not quite sort of strict Zoroastrianism. And the author is someone who used the pen name Mobad, or kind of the word for a Zoroastrian priest, as his poetic pen name. And so he seems to be associated with this Ozar Kayvani school, and provides really, really sort of rich pictures of different schools of religious thought, as well as descriptions of his contemporaries. And the circles of the Dagestan's author and the circles of Dara Shukoh overlapped.
This I when I saw this quote, I mean, I loved it. I want to like get it blown up in like a poster size and stick it on my wall so that I can always, when my kids ask questions, I can just point to it, because this is, I'll read, if it's okay, just a paragraph from your, it's on page 171. Other Muslim authorities in Dara's age also regarded Kabir, you'll have to explain to us who Kabir is, also regarded Kabir as a monotheist. In the Akhbar al-Akhyar, the renowned Abdul Haq of Delhi, he's a 17th century kind of hadith and law scholar, Sufi, of course, relates an anecdote involving Kabir that he heard from his uncle. Apparently, when Abdul Haq's father was a young child, he asked his own father, was this famous Kabir whose utterances people recite a Muslim or a kafir? Abdul Haq's grandfather replied that Kabir was a monotheist, muvahid. The child then asked, does that mean that a muvahid is neither a kafir nor a Muslim? To which the old man retorted, to understand this matter is difficult. Later you will understand. That was a terrific. So I mean, who is Kabir? And I don't know. In some, this is obviously I'm just some guy reading the book, but I felt like this, in a lot of ways, this quote summarized so much of the discourse and the kind of ideas floating around the person of Dara Shukoh and the kind of the world that people put him in, like an intellectual world. So can you tell us more about this quote?
Yeah, so it's not, frankly, I don't have a whole lot of sort of contextualization for this particular quote. And, I think one or two other scholars in India have also kind of chanced upon that as something that, that was interesting, when we're just looking for better ways to understand, who a muvahid is, what are these terms that people are using to talk about each other. Kabir is this, again, really fascinating figure. His exact dates are sort of, again, sort of difficult to ascertain. In modern India, he is kind of viewed as a figure from this, again, this is a sort of a modern idea, the Bhakti movement, which is a sort of, again, a phenomenon of devotion, where one has charismatic poet, sort of saints or gurus who are emerging and whose songs and poetry are orally passed down. So we have a huge amount of poetry from Kabir that eventually gets written down. It makes its way into the Sikh scripture, Guru Granth Sahib. It makes its way into other collections. We have whole communities of devotion that are set up, again, following Kabir. Kabir himself is inserted into different kind of devotional lineages. And just like lots of other religious figures, whether it's later on Guru Nanak, a figure called Banwali Das Wali later on, Kabir too, he's said to have been born into the family of, or adopted by a family of Muslim weavers. And his own religious identity is sort of hard to pin down. There's this idea that Hindus wanted to cremate him after his death. Muslims wanted to bury him. In the end, when his shroud was lifted, there were only flowers left. So he couldn't be pinned down to any one religion, but of course, what he spoke about was bhakti, was devotion to the one divine, a formless divine, again, not a divine with sort of, whom one can sort of see and describe. And he was merciless in criticizing both Muslim and Hindu religious authorities. So he spared no one. His poetry is very hard-hitting, and he spoke of this one divine. And Dara Shukoh hears of Kabir, and of course, Kabir has been known in Persian sources, and he also discusses Kabir with Baba Lal, who might have been connected to that lineage.
One idea you kind of And Mizan, I probably just will be the last question because I want to make sure people have time to ask questions.
No, we've got about 10 minutes before we go into Q&A.
Okay.
10 minutes, yeah, take your time check.
So you, as far as I recall, you kind of offered this as a hypothesis. You weren't, making a strong commitment to the idea, but I thought it was fascinating. I think at least when you read kind of Indian Islamic history, intellectual history, you often come across the Wahdat al-Wujud versus Wahdat al-Shuhud and debate, and that this is like really intense. I mean, Ibn Arabi is controversial all over the place, but I mean, it seems like in South Asia, it's just this really something's going on. And you have the idea that this might be linked to kind of the possibility of seeing this as a counterpart to kind of monism in Indian religion. So, I mean, is that something that is that like a theory, or do you feel like that was if I'm expressing it properly? Maybe you can tell us about that if I'm making a mistake.
Oh yeah. So in fact, this is something that again really requires more research. There's a whole lot of work done, so in Dara Shukoh's time, there was a lot of writing done about Ibn Arabi. There were, his own, he corresponded with Sheikh Muhibbullah Allahabadi, who was a commentator and a translator of various works of Ibn Arabi. Dara Shukoh himself is not interested in going into the nitty-gritties of philosophy, kind of really difficult, abstruse stuff. There are other ways in which this idea of Wahdatul Wujud seeped into other arenas of life. Now, a lot of kind of in the modern times, Wahdatul Wujud is opposed to this Wahdatul Shuhud. I mean, I think, this polarization is a bit of a sort of modern thing. And there's this idea that Wahdatul Wujud that is automatically linked to maybe more fondness or more interest in Indic religions, sort of more heterodox ideas and so on. But the fact is, I think it's more complicated than that. There were advocates of Wahdatul Wujud who didn't necessarily have any overt interest in Indic religions at all. You could be like a great scholar of Ibn Arabi and focus on that, but it doesn't mean that you sort of go out and you go and like have dialogues with, sannyasis and so on. On the other hand, so there's no kind of strict association of Wahdatul Wujud with an interest in Indic thought. But there are other ways, so one didn't have to necessarily be a student of the school of Ibn Arabi to be interested in this. I think there are many different levels at which this played out.
I hate to ask you about something really technical, because usually those are the things that in my books that I don't actually understand that well. So I hope nobody asks me about them. But you talk about this, the kufr haqiqi versus Islam majazi theme that's part of the Ain al-Quzat al-Hamadani tradition that Dara Shukoh, the Halajian and Ain al-Quzat al-Hamadani tradition that Dara Shukoh belongs to. If you don't want to talk about this, you can say, "Oh, look at the time. I think we should do Q&A." But if you do have, if you can talk about, I thought it was really interesting, and I couldn't grasp some of the ideas. I think that I didn't have the background, but I don't know if you feel comfortable talking about it.
Could you refer to a particular page that?
Yeah, I could. Of course, now I've like. Should never have asked this question. Let's see. Yeah, it's page 156. Dara became devoted to, these are my notes, sorry people, devoted to monist tradition of Halaj and Ain al-Quzat al-Hamadani, idea of kufr haqiqi as true versus Islam majazi. She, the author, sees this as his interest as preceded by Akbar's Deen Ilahi, which had similar themes on 156.
Oh, right. Yes. So this is, this is, I was trying to contextualize something that modern commentators have taken in a very literal sense. So on the previous page here, so Dara Shukoh is writing to one of his spiritual teachers. Again, he branches out quite a bit, even with his Sufi teachers, and he is writing to one Shah Dilruba, and he's saying, sort of, praise God that from the blessing of love of this kind of great taifa, again, that's referring to his sort of Sufi community, in Islam Majazi, kind of insincere Islam, has fled the heart of this fakir, and kufr hakiki has shown its face. So modern thinkers, they view this and they say, like, look at Dara Shukoh, he's renouncing Islam, he's accepting kufr. And then some people say, wow, this is a great thing, he's like not a good Muslim, that's a great thing. And other people say, well, just look at him, he had no interest in Islam. And, Dara Shukoh actually never really renounced Islam, but there was a whole vocabulary for talking about kind of embracing what sort of Leonard Lewison has also written about as mystical infidelity. And there's a whole language from this, from Ainul Qudat Hamadani to Shabaz Tari and so on. So there's this whole language in kind of Persianate Sufism for embracing mystical infidelity as a way of more truly kind of accessing this kind of rising above duality. And Dara Shukoh he's tapping into this, and Akbar has also sort of kind of done this in a sense in his construction of a kind of sacred kingship, and Dara Shukoh is tapping into this in his own way.
I guess that would you would see that in the Halajian idea of like
yes.
the devil as the monotheist, so like refuses to bow to Adam, right? He only so that this image, so you kind of invert the imagery, and also you see in like the Melamati and the idea of
and of course one has that in Halaj, one has that in Persian mysticism, Sanai and so on, and it's sort of so it's it's an established theme, and then and it gains a new valence in India. So because in the Persian sort of Iranian context, they're not necessarily kind of going out, and putting on a Brahmin sacred thread or anything like that, or sort of, necessarily not everyone who is expressing this is going out and having dialogues with those, regarded as kafir, or sort of being associated with kufr. So in the South Asian context, that then is given a new valence with the actual presence of Indians and of non-Muslims.
Folks, it's fun. I mean, when I read the book, I actually emailed questions to Professor Gandhi, and I think she kind of probably got annoyed with my questions. But this is my chance to ask all the questions I had. But I want to make sure that everyone has questions. Otherwise, I'll just keep asking questions, and you guys will have to put up with my interests. Mizan, do you want me?
We'll come back to you.
We'll
come back to you, Jack. I think we've got quite a few questions on the chat. Okay, so folks, if you want to ask questions, please raise your hands. If you want to ask the presenter directly, otherwise you can put it in chat. I just want to get to Amaru. Can you say a little bit more about the character himself? Because a little bit about the character and the rivalry between Aurangzeb and him.
So you want a little more about the character of Dara Shukoh? Yeah.
And another question from Khalid was, how did he view Ahmad Sir Hindi, especially with the Bak-to-Bak letters? Yeah, well, so the second question is sort of simpler and easier to understand. He doesn't talk a whole lot about Ahmad Sir Hindi, but there is one instance where he talks about him in a fairly sympathetic manner. So the idea that the kind of Qadiri Sufis of Dara Shukoh, Mia Mir, and so on were totally opposed to the Ahmad Sir Hindi, the Naqshbandis, is sort of I think that's more of a modern idea that becomes entrenched later on. So he's fairly sympathetic, and I think he's really critical of his grandfather Jahangir for being too harsh on Sufis. And of course, one major instance of that is the way Jahangir treated Ahmad Sir Hindi. With regard to Dara Shukoh's personality,
I've tried to do actually is to give in the book different angles on this, both from Dara's own writings as well as those, the attitudes of those around him. But I've tried not to reduce his personality down to a few sort of stereotypical points, because I've seen that is what happens in later works. We have European accounts, especially European travelers who might not have had much to do with Dara at all, but they wrote certain things about him that he, oh yes, he was perhaps vain, arrogant, and so on, terrible soldier. And then those become sort of entrenched as fact. They reach later accounts, they become embedded in colonial accounts, they keep getting repeated. So it's almost as though in the modern day, we know Dara Shukoh and Aurangzeb so well because they're still alive around us. So what I've tried to do is to instead to have more of a mosaic with the fractures and with the kind of multiple pieces, giving an insight into their personalities and to their or rather taking away the attention from the personality to sort of the more complex arc of their lives, how they represented them and how other people represented them.
Okay, got a question from Rizwan, is our regular question. Rizwan, I'm gonna unmute you, makes my life easy because you write so much on the chat.
Thank you. So
ask about 3 questions, it's fine, I know.
Okay,
I know you're going to come back later on, please.
Thank you. So my first question is in relationship about his Dara Shukoh's relationship with Sarmad, the antinomian mystic, a Muslim mystic. Well, yeah, and what can we read into this in terms of his relationship, his perception of antinomianism more generally, antinomian Sufism. So that's one of my questions. And also, are there was there influence of the tradition of the Obadi Sufi Prem Kahanis? Because they were speaking in a language. I mean, is there any sort of similarities between that tradition, mystical Sufi, tradition, which tried to sort of use the language of the Indic language, and terminology to but obviously this was sort of in poetry. So I just was wondering whether there, what if there's some influences from that sort of tradition. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so let's start with Sarmad first. So one of the fullest accounts of Sarmad is found in the Dabastani-Mazahib. And absolutely, he was kind of an antinomian Sufi who traveled. He was born into a Jewish family, and he came to the subcontinent. He had a companion, a Hindu youth called Abhay Chand, and he wrote poetry. We don't hear a lot in the Dabistan, or much at all, about Sarmad's relationship with Dara Shukoh. We hear of that from a European traveler who's also very disgusted with Sarmad, because he would roam around without clothes and so on. And in later accounts of the War of Succession, we hear about the execution of Sarmad, and there's a way in which the execution of Sarmad sort of stands in for or parallels the killing of Dara Shukoh. So there are ways in which, yes, Sarmad is associated with Dara Shukoh. We don't have much in the way of Dara Shukoh's own words about Sarmad. There is one letter that seems to have survived that is attributed to Dara Shukoh. And that, again, talks in very sort of passionate terms about his reverence for Sarmad and close association with him. Interestingly, so Sarmad and Abhay Chand translated from the kind of book of Genesis into Persian. Some excerpts of that are in the Dabistan. And we have Dara Shukoh talk about how he, in his introduction to the Syriac, but in his introduction to the Upanishad translation, how he actually plumbed other traditions for this font of monotheism that he was searching after. And he doesn't find it in the Jewish and Christian scriptures. He finds it in the Upanishads. So, and he might have been, and he was also acquainted with kind of European Jesuits who would have acquainted him with the Bible and so on. But I think, so there's a suggestion that if he indeed learned a bit about Jewish scriptures from Sarmad, it wasn't profound enough to have him believe that this was the font of monotheism. Yeah, but we don't have too much of an insight into their own relationship. With regard to your other question, absolutely. So now the Awadhi Sufi Premakhyans do represent another face of this encounter between Islam and Indic religions. We have here Sufis using an Awadhi idiom to talk about the divine, to talk about, to have these allegorical romances. I don't have any evidence of Dara Shukoh's own engagement with them, but there were people connected to him who had an engagement. In fact, when Jahangir was a prince, he did have one of those Premakhyans translated into Persian and lavishly illustrated. Again, that's one of the manuscripts that's currently in the Chester Beatty Library. And one of Aurangzeb's associates, who may have written, maybe the author of an account of the War of Succession, also had a Persian translation of this Premakhyans. So what happens is that these Premakhyans are one kind of face of this encounter, and then later on, sort of the circle is complete when they get translated into Persian. So it's a kind of ongoing sort of encounter.
A question from Zach. Zach, I've unmuted you.
Thank you, Misan, and thank you for the session so far. I was reading the book and I found the book to be quite good. It's a new interest for me. So there's just a few questions. I had 3 questions as well. I hope mine are a lot simpler. The first one is, how did Dara respond in his writings to Akbar's ideas that he would have read or come across himself being a descendant? The second one was, how prominent, because you've talked about how Shah Jahan destroyed a temple when he went, I think it was a Brahmin temple that he destroys. It's quite early on in the book when you're talking about his history. How prominent was that during the for Mughal emperors to do? And the last one is, I think you talk about how Dara looked at Shah Jahan as somebody that he closely modeled himself after and emulated, but also responded to critically as well. So going forward, if he had won the succession, would he have also then followed the same chain of becoming more religious as time went on as well? Do we also see that as a possibility, moving away from him being this liberal person that a lot of people expected him to be?
Thank you. So your first question about Akbar, how prominent was Akbar as a very kind of overt model for Dara Shukoh? I would say that Dara Shukoh did indeed model himself on Akbar's kind of sacred kingship that again embraced what might be considered kufr, again embraced that as part of his own sort of spiritual fashioning. But Dara Shukoh didn't acknowledge this. He didn't acknowledge this because he was making for himself some rather grandiose claims that Akbar didn't need to make because he had Abul Fazl and others make those claims for him. So in his Sakinatul Awliya, he talks about receiving the spiritual gift that no emperor had before him. Again, he is the favored one of his peer. He's achieving all these spiritual gifts. So it would kind of undermine the persona that he's portraying if he were to say that he's modeling himself after Akbar. So he doesn't openly do that, but I'm sure he like read stuff that was in Akbar's library and was very, very aware of him. Your second question was, could you just remind me again with just a word or two? Hello, Zach?
Sorry, the second one was about temple raising and how common that was as a practice.
Yes, thank you. Now, it wasn't horribly common. I mean, we have the important work by Richard Eaton that kind of discusses and contextualizes, temple destruction, temple desecration, and points out importantly that, of course, a ruler's sovereignty is very closely associated with the temple and the deity in the temple. And Muslim rulers were not alone at all in attacking this as a simple symbol of sovereignty. So what I try to do in the book is to kind of show how this is only part of the picture and not a full picture. So I do start with an image of Jahangir going and desecrating a temple, and he's desecrating this temple because he's wanting to deal with and kind of frighten some unruly Rajputs who are rebelling in that region. And yes, there's a desecration, and often what happened was that it wouldn't necessarily be totally destroyed, and it was specific. It was contextual. Similarly, with Jahangir, he does have he has this kind of promulgation that temples, not the temples that were already built, but those that were in the process of construction, be raised. And he was doing this to assert his authority soon after he came to the throne. So it was contextual, and it didn't represent the whole range of these rulers' engagements with Hindus.
We've got a comment or question from Mustafa. How does it say? Okay, question about relevance today. What does it mean for India and the BJP because of the revisionist history that's going on? And secondly, that's the question. That's the comment he's saying.
Yeah. So unfortunately, there is this very concerning trend in India today of not only revisionist history, but of course, revisionist history being endorsed and promulgated by the state. So there is the idea that the nation is somehow synonymous with the state and with a particular political party with a certain ideology. So it's a far more narrow and exclusionary idea of the nation, of nationhood, citizenship, belonging, then it doesn't necessarily leave room for other ideas. So I do find this quite concerning. And so funnily enough, this kind of revisionist history also goes along with another attitude to history, and that is the attitude that history is a history of heroes and villains. So it's all about heroes and villains. And so if you write a book about someone, it must mean that you are endorsing that particular person or maybe lionizing them, unless you're kind of like very explicitly saying you're writing a book denouncing someone. And a lot of the details in my book and the kind of sort of contextualization definitely go against this revisionist history completely. What I found surprising after I wrote the book, or not surprising, but what I found, something that I've observed, is that Dara Shukoh has been partially appropriated by Hindu nationalists in India today. And he's acceptable in many ways. He's acceptable because he never actually became the emperor. He was killed. Akbar, on the other hand, is still controversial. That there's a sense that, well, he might have been better, but still, he was like one of those terrible Muslim rulers. It's sort of that is the attitude. Dara Shukoh is seen as someone who's a little more acceptable. So in fact, there was this whole government push to find his actual grave and identify it and kind of commemorate it. But even that, comes with a caveat. Of course, it's a sort of symbolic thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that it's reflective of a kind of broader tolerance or pluralism.
Comment, a question, I think that's from, can't read their name, about the sources. You're using very different sources. Can you talk more about the sources you're using from traditional Farsi sources?
Yeah.
And
so
why are you using those sources? It's a very interesting angle, because it's not been done before by Pakistani historians or Indian Muslim historians. They've never touched that aspect or that angle.
Well, so I think definitely, some historians have definitely touched on some of the sources. But I think what I've tried to do is to distinguish between much later representations and earlier ones. And I've tried to balance, and it's not always an easy or successful balance, perhaps, but I've tried to balance telling a story with also talking about representation. So say you have something like the War of Succession, and you have all these different viewpoints on it, and these viewpoints are happening like later, but some not so much later, and some are happening much later. And you sort of and you distinguish that because the narrative does change. So yes, there are a range of Persian sources. And you always have to be kind of aware of the particular point of view. So, Shah Jahan is writing his own revisionist histories of Jahangir's reign and so on. You have chronicles, you have letters, firmans and so on. And then there are, of course, Sanskrit and Hindavi sources as well. There are European sources, there are like some Arabic sources. So it's a multilingual milieu. And of course, there are just a whole range of sources that each give us a different perspective on a particular issue.
Fantastic. Before I hand it over to Jack, you've got another 15 minutes to ask questions and interview. That's absolutely fine, as long as that's okay. Last one from me. Tell us about Takht, the movie. It's coming up. It's about the subject. Did they use your book for reference? Just out of interest.
Well, if they did,
I'm looking forward to A.R. Rahman's music, but that's about it.
I've been curious about the movie because they keep delaying it. If they used my book, they did not ask me for it or pay me for it or anything like that. Initially when I heard about it, I didn't have the highest expectations. There've been lots of Bollywood movies that have really kind of simplified the Mughals or sort of just, had a really stark, good, bad sort of division. Another thing is that movies on historical themes in India always seem to run into difficulties. There are people who take offense and protest and so on. I've heard some good things about the writer of the screenplay for Takht. So we might have actually something that's kind of fairly complex. Again, it's a movie. It's not a documentary.
Karan Johar is generally quite balanced. He's not that. Very interesting. He's going to play Aurangzeb, and could be Anil Kapoor. I don't know. But Jack, is over to you now.
Well, I'm just wondering, in the audience, is there any person maybe who is a female student who used to go to Oxford, who took me on a tour of Oxford, who wants to ask a question? I have to do this. We don't want to have, only, I don't know. Okay. Anyway, well, people can ask questions if they want.
Yeah, you've got the next 15 minutes. Bismillah.
Well, I want to.
We're enjoying this session. Is that okay, Supriya? You got time?
Yeah, that's
15 minutes max. Yeah.
There's some of the interesting one scene I thought was fascinating was, you talk a lot about Jahanara in the book. that Nadira, the wife of Dara, that she makes, I think, some nobleman her milk child,
Yes.
by giving him water to drink that she had washed her breast with.
Right.
Is this was this like something they came up with on the spot, or is this like a kind of established tradition? And we know about milk children in Islamic tradition, but I mean this way of doing it and doing it for like someone you want to make your ally, is this something that was established, or they came up with it?
I actually haven't heard a whole lot of other examples of the same thing. But I think it's understandable. The idea of milk kinship was very, very important for the Mughals. We see this in the Akbarnama, that the wives of the few noblemen who had accompanied his father Humayun on his exile when he'd lost his kingdom, he really didn't have anything. And then there were a few people who stuck with him and helped him along during this difficult exile. And they get written into the Akbarnama. Their names are recorded. The women's names or epithets are recorded. And the idea is that each of their positive qualities would somehow, enter into Akbar, and he was sort of bound to them. So the Akbarnama really makes a big deal of milk kinship, and we don't hear too much about the details of Dara's own milk kin, partly because he never made it to emperor. Those who become emperor, then your milk kin, they get to build mosques, and they get like important posts and so on.
Although you mentioned there's this, I think one of his nursemaids endows like a waqf with like a market and stuff like that. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes, and Shah Jahan's as well. Yeah.
Oh, was it Shah Jahan's?
Yeah.
It was probably Shah Jahan's. But I thought that was actually really interesting because you had I suppose somebody who was essentially a servant in the household, but obviously because they're a servant in the household, they're still pretty high up. That was it. She was a servant, or was she just someone who was a nurse, a woman who was a noble woman who happened to have nursed him?
Yes, they were often married to nobles. They were, and the idea is that their kind of dispositions would be passed on via the milk to the child, so they were selected carefully and so on. But yes, there definitely was this idea that milk was parallel to blood, and this is a situation where you can't really trust your kind of blood siblings. You can't. Brothers can fight themselves for the throne, but your milk kin won't betray you, except that actually, in actual fact, there are many instances of milk kin kind of taking their positions for granted, acting out, and then the emperor has to kind of punish them.
Doesn't not a good idea to cross these people.
Right.
No other people are asking questions, Mizan?
No, carry on, bro.
So this one guy I thought was hysterical. This Thomas, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Coriat,
yes.
This guy is a hoot. I mean, I don't know if I would want to be around him, but he was. So at one point he gets up and like he hears the azan. I guess he's part of this initial kind of a very early English delegation to the Mughals. And he hears the azan and he gets up and he starts saying, in Arabic that there's no God. Hazrat Isa is the son of God, and Muhammad is an imposter or something. And you think like and then everyone just sort of like thinks he's crazy and leaves him alone. But so did you come was he sort of one of these early, I don't want to say kind of white Mughals or whatever, like one of these early folks who goes to the Islamic world or South Asia, the Orient, and becomes enchanted with its ways?
Yes, absolutely. And I think he's, so he's, he is one of these figures, and his travels are kind of written and letters written in a rather amusing manner. And indeed, that's how he portrays himself, as a kind of buffoon or a jester. And he's contrast to the rather stiff Sir Thomas Roe, the ambassador of King James to the court of Jahangir. So he's one of these many figures who seem to have recorded their conversations and interactions with the emperor. Again, with Jahangir, we just have so many who record their dialogues with him. And it does give one an insight into the cosmopolitanism of that particular court. And Korea and observers do comment that this is a contrast from Europe, from England of the time, where here he is saying this really blasphemous thing, and just people tolerate him.
I guess there was a wide variety of people in these cities.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, I mean, Mizan, I don't want to take up too much time, so it's up to you. I mean,
yeah, we've got just about 5 minutes, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
So here's this is a tough. I guess this is a tough question to answer. Is the kind of the Aurangzeb calling Dara an apostate? Is that? Do you think that comes about? He does it as he's going to kind of marching on Agra, right? So he writes this, I guess, like a letter or announcement or something. But then you point out that like this is just part of, this is not like the dominant theme of the impending conflict, right? Because the other figures who are going back and forth between them or like in each other's group, no one else is talking about this. So it's just, I mean, is it something that gets played up and inflated in retrospect or when they decide to execute him? Or is this something that was like always there before and then Aurangzeb decided like, okay, now I'm going to really level this accusation?
Yeah, so I think it's a tricky issue. In modern times, the War of Succession has been seen as a kind of religious war, that you have Hindu nobles and Dara on the one hand, that you have the staunch Sunnis and Aurangzeb on the other hand, and that Dara Shukoh was very much portrayed as an infidel. And we have kind of hints of that in some European accounts and other accounts. So I wanted to look into that. And I found, though, that one can't completely dispense with the idea that Dara Shukoh was being portrayed as an apostate. We do have some hints of that. Again, these sources too we don't have any kind of a direct window into those times. These sources have been redacted and come down to us in different forms. So we have Aurangzeb's letter to Murad, where he says we need to team up against this infidel, or this apostate. But of course, those letters too were written down by a secretary, incorporated into other collections. Doesn't mean that they weren't necessarily authentic. So these sources themselves, of course, their constructions in a particular time and place in a particular way. We can't see into their minds. But it seems to be that there is a little bit of this rhetoric. It's not necessarily the sole narrative. And one thing that really struck me in many of these accounts is that different figures are appealing to religion in different ways. But we have Jahanara, for instance, telling Aurangzeb, she goes to him with a proposal from her father for peace. And she says, we'll give you the main kingdom, or you can sort of split the kingdom and share it. But you really ought to listen. You ought to respect your elder brother, because in the Sharia, he's supposed to be like a father to you. So family relations, filial devotion, and so on. These are seen as the kinds of piety. So the ways in which the idea of Islam is portrayed in these sources is quite broad. It's not only the Sharia, but it's a kind of whole broader idea of ethics. So when Murad is being, again, cheated by Aurangzeb, he's also a kind of appealing to religion, again, in the way these sources represent.
Do you think if Dara had won, he would have had Aurangzeb executed?
He probably would have had to.
Interesting.
Is there ever a Mughal prince, brother who's like, look, I just want to, open a restaurant and like play pool for the rest of my life. I'm not going to do anything. Like, was there ever a guy who convinced? Because it seems like even the guys who are just like, look, I really don't want to have anything to do with this, they always get executed. So is there ever a guy who just made it out and,
So, I mean, Dara Shukoh, he tried to do that, at least according to some of the sources. Aurangzeb was not convinced. Khurram's own elder brother Khusro he was already blinded. One would think that like he wouldn't be much of a threat, but still he dispensed with him. So yeah, it was difficult. Now again, of course, the Mughals were not alone in this. And if one looks at also 16th, 17th century Europe, England, I mean, there were just horrible punishments and things that were going on. So it's not as though the Mughals were alone in this kind of treatment.
Yeah, like the Ottomans. I mean,
yeah.
Well, I mean, I had I'm really happy I got to. When Mizan told me about this, I really forced myself into I said, I want to do this book, please let me do this. I really like the book. So I'm happy to have had a chance to talk to you and ask you about the book. And I think
yeah, Jonathan, thank you. That that's so kind, and I'm so thrilled that you engage with this. And it's wonderful to have in after writing this engagements with different kinds of readers. There are readers with a background in South Asia, or readers from South Asia, or those who work on South Asian studies, and it's wonderful also to engage with those who work in kind of the broader field of Islamic studies, because often South Asia gets sort of pushed to the margins of that. So I think increasing such dialogues is a really good thing.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Mizan,
Jack.
I'm going to go to a faculty meeting. Yay.
No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you so much, Jack. Just one quick one. Supriya, what is your next book? What are your next piece of work? Just for the folks out there.
Yeah, so my next book actually looks at modern Hinduism, and it asks, what does a history of modern Hinduism look like from the perspective of material in Persian and Urdu? Because of course, many Hindus were writing in Persian. They were later writing in Urdu, and Persian was kind of the link language from the Mughal era, over to the colonial era. So what can we learn about the emergence of modern Hinduism looking at that?
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Professor Jack's just gone, Jonathan's gone. Thank you so much, Supriya, Professor Supriya. Wonderful. Hopefully people buy the book, or they should have read the book. That's the whole point of the review discussion. But hopefully we're looking forward to your next book, and maybe we can do a book review discussion again, if that's okay. Whenever. When's it due, the next one?
That would be lovely. Well, I do hope to finish it within the next year. Let's see.
Next year, hopefully next year or so. Thank you so much, folks. If you have, you'll get a link to the recording. So if you're not on our mailing list, put your email there. Otherwise, you can contact the professor directly on her website at Yale. Take care. Good night, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum.